Great, thank you very much. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining me at this Developer Days DaVinci Implementer Tools session. We will be answering questions hopefully during the session, but certainly at the end. So if you have any questions, please put them into the chat. The goal for this session is to orient those of you who aren't so familiar with what we're doing in DaVinci, and then really focus the majority of this presentation on what tools we have put together and resources for implementers to pick up our implementation guides, to test them, and to participate in the HL7 and DaVinci and FHIR communities in building out the implementations and to really make these guides better. So really briefly, a little bit about me. I'm a physician informaticist. I'm part of the HL7 and FHIR Foundation board. I'm the technical director for the HL7 DaVinci project and have been really happy and feel very fortunate to have been part of this DaVinci and the FHIR community for the past 8 years or so. So for those of you who are new to the community, welcome. We know it's a little daunting, but hopefully with this presentation, will help orient you with some tools to help you get up to speed in your organization, to get up to speed as quickly as you possibly can. So for those unfamiliar with DaVinci, we were really formed about 3.5 years ago to really address the challenges around interoperability. And I won't go into that because you hopefully already know that because you're here, and really take the needs of the particular provider, payer, vendor, and ultimately patient perspectives and identify a number of important use cases and areas where we can improve interoperability by developing FHIR-based implementation guides and then implementing them so that we're all essentially singing from the same song sheet or using the same SOPs, or pick whatever metaphor works best for you. And so this year we have about 50 members ranging from across the country of providers, EHR vendors, both national and regional payer organizations, deployment members that are helping us to scale what we're doing, and of course a number of vendors who are offering tools and services around FHIR in general and DaVinci implementation guides in particular. And we work closely with HL7, HIMSS, and NCQA to help bring in that broader community, provide perspective, and then also to promote the work that we're doing. So we've had a number of use cases. I've counted at last count 11 implementation guides that we've created in the past 3.5 years, which if you're part of the standards community, you'll realize that that is no small feat for a group of folks. But we have a number of these guides, and they're each in one or more categories of use cases that we've identified that are needed. At the top left, kind of working from there, we have a quality improvement, and it's really one guide, the Data Exchange for Quality Measures guide, that works in conjunction with the Quality Measures IG, the QI Core IG, and the CQL IG, and we use those FHIR building blocks to create this data exchange. And that IG is focused on how do you share quality measure data between payers and providers or other entities that are part of the quality measure ecosystem. And then with that, recently we added a component called Gaps in Care, where we created a methodology for requesting the gaps in care, the quality measure gaps for individual patients, as well as combining it with a member attribution list, a list of patients, so you can get that for a population. At the bottom left, we have a number of guides. I'm sorry if you can hear my cat. A number of guides related to prior authorization and burden reduction that help identify or answer essentially 3 questions of: do I need a prior authorization? If I need a prior authorization, what information do I need to gather for the payer so that I can get that authorization? Sorry, my cat's walking on my desk. That authorization adjudicated and approved or denied, and then how do I submit that data to the payer so that that clinical structured data can be used by them in their utilization management tools to speed up the time to answer the prior authorization request, with the goal of minimizing the clinician burden for collecting data on their staff for communicating with the payer and reducing the time and the potential delays in the care delivery for the patients. Of note is that we have a HIPAA exception request that was approved by CMS that allows us to use FHIR end-to-end with the payer and not have to use the X12 transactions, though we do use X12 values and code sets. We have a number of guides around member access that are named in the CMS Patient Access API rule that allows patients to receive their clinical data from payers, as well as knowing what formulary medications they're on, as well as the tiers of those medications, and then a FHIR-based provider directory that lets them find out who is in their provider network based on the plan. So those are all really important and are going into implementation in July. So these are a great way to engage and give more information to members. We have other work on the right-hand side around exchanging data between payers to other payers that were named in some proposed rules from CMS, as well as the ability to exchange data and requests for data between payers and providers, as well as providers to providers in situations such as referrals and discharges and things like that. We have a guide that's a kind of a foundational guide around member attribution that is a methodology for risk-based organizations today to share their member attribution lists, which are really important because they go into population health and other aspects. And we're updating that guide currently, and we'll be doing some Connectathons on that guide for use for CMS's data at point of care, as well as fee-for-service. So how do you use attribution for patients who are decide who they want to see and establish their relationship based on the patient's choice. We have another one, risk adjustment, that is in flight now and is in public calls. Actually, later on today, there's a public call around it, and it's a way of sharing risk-based coding information between payers and providers to make sure that appropriate risk adjustments are information is exchanged. And then one that we will be bringing live in the next few weeks around patient cost transparency. This is actually a really hot topic, and we've been invited to a number of presentations to discuss what we're doing because there are some regulatory activity around it with legislation from Congress last fall around no surprises. So keep your eyes out for community calls related to this. So this is just another view of these use cases. If I won't be going in much more into the use cases. I did a presentation just yesterday where I went down another level on these use cases. So please take a look at that recording in Whova from yesterday's set of presentations, and the slides will be available there as well. But what this reflects is where we are in terms of maturity of the use cases and implementation guides. These dark dials let you know that the guides have been balloted and published, and that the dials are really where they're being picked up by organizations and then put into production. So this is the one-page summary I offered from yesterday, a list of guides, where they are in their publication cycle, a couple that are soon to be published, in particular this update to the data exchange for quality measure with gaps in care. Our clinical data exchange is in ballot reconciliation now, along with the health record exchange. We have these two new use cases that I've mentioned, and we expect that we will be participating in Connectathons with CMS as well as in September. And then we have hopefully some ballots coming up in the near future. All right. So for those unfamiliar with kind of our process, we in DaVinci, our membership pools their resources, they're both people as well as their financial resources to help us identify important use cases that I've just described. Then they bring in their subject matter expertise to help us define the scope for these use cases, and that scope helps us have a starting place before we take calls into the HL7 process and into community calls. And through that open HL7 standards development process, we further define the business requirements and workflow, as well as the data requirements from which we develop the FHIR implementation guides through a FHIR gap analysis, through Connectathons, and also for this audience, we build a number of, we call them reference implementations, but probably a better term is sample applications to help the community and the developers understand and exemplify the data exchange, whether they be the FHIR resources, profiles, or operations that we use in a particular guide. And that's what we'll be looking at today. So for the remainder of this discussion, what I'd like to do is kind of divide it up into three kind of major categories. And I have some screenshots in the slide deck so that people could reference them later. But really what I want to do is to use these links in each of these sections to tour the resources to help orient you into what we have available for you. Because we heard very early on in Da Vinci that the community really wanted transparency, and so we've gone, I think, above and beyond, almost to the extent of too much information about what we're doing. But I think with that information, we really try to empower the community to learn and understand what we're doing. So we're going to talk about what information sources are available. We'll talk about some of the code base of these implementations, sample implementations, a testing environment, and then we'll talk about how you can engage with us through our calls and more information about getting education. So first of all, we have the Da Vinci Confluence homepage, and I'm going to pull that over for you. So hopefully you can see that. If you can't see that, please let me know from the HL7 staff. So this is the homepage for Da Vinci on Confluence. So HL7 has a Confluence page, confluence.hl7.org, and one of the links is a set of the FHIR accelerators. This web page really is where the starting point for you for the community. Important things here, we try to keep this up to date in terms of our upcoming community roundtables. We try to feature certain topics of use cases that we're doing each month. When we do these community roundtables, we try to give you an update, whether it be our activities in conferences or regulatory updates during these community roundtables. And then we bring our members and our use case leads to talk about individual use cases, as well as our membership and the community in talking about implementations, production level implementations that they're doing based on our guides. Over here on the right-hand side, you can actually download our presentations, these slide decks, so that you can share them within your own organizations. So this is a nice kind of starting page. We have blog posts and just a number of high-level resources for you. But what we really want you to focus on is the ability to kind of navigate our Confluence page on the left-hand side. And so from here, I want to show you this implementation guide dashboard. And so this is the link to that. And on the slide deck that you'll get, we'll have these particular links. But this implementation guide dashboard is really where you can find kind of a one-stop shop around the IGs themselves. So on this page, we have the slide that I showed you just a little earlier, and we have this table. And this table allows you to filter, whether you're alphabetically, whether or not a grouping of the focus area of the implementation guide. So we have a link directly to the guides themselves. So if you opened here, you could go directly to the Data Exchange for Quality IG. And if you're a developer, you should be familiar with the fact that we have various versions of the guide. And so you can look at the history of the guides. We have the project pages. That takes you to the project page based on the HL7 work groups. So you can see who's involved from that. We have, we're going to build this part out, but we talk about the initial scenarios that we're addressing in each of these guides. We'll give you a sense of where we are in the ballot reconciliation for the guide. So this happens to be the data exchange for quality measures. And we created, and now is being adopted by the other FHIR accelerators, a quick dashboard for you to see where we are in terms of the ballot comments and their resolution. So here we should have pretty much everything applied, and we're working on doing the final publishing of the guide in the build server. So again, very useful information, links to where we've done presentations of the work, the kind of a status of where we are we on continuing work group calls, or some of our use cases are in a little bit of a pause, particularly the notifications as we wait for the subscriptions work to be well defined. We have linked to our the sponsoring work groups if you want to participate in some of the ballot reconciliation work with the work group. A link to the PSS for the use case and the guide, and then for any of the reference implementations, which I'll get to in a little bit, as well as Zulip Stream, which I'll get to in a little bit. So this is a nice kind of one-stop shop place to find information about the various guides, how they come together, and what their status is. So I will go back to the presentation. So here was the Da Vinci Confluence page. Next up is that implementation dashboard that I presented, and you'll have the links here in the handouts. Now, next up is this implementer support page. So this was created in response to the need of the community to figure out where to start. Because for those of you who have been fortunate to have been in the community for a number of years, you've kind of learned kind of on the job, where do I put all this information together? How do I go from core FHIR resources and APIs to an implementation guide? How do I use these various guides that link to one another? Like I mentioned in the data exchange for quality measure, we use QI core and CDS and CQL. So how do we put this all together? So we heard that concern from the community and put together this implementer support page. And the reality is this implementer support page, the first set of it, is good for any FHIR accelerator or just getting into the FHIR community. It's not, the first part is really not specific to Da Vinci, but here are the links to what you need to know about FHIR. So here are links to the FHIR specification itself, links to US core, the Da Vinci project. Because we are a part of the US realm, we ground our work in the US core profiles whenever they're available, and in compliance with the US realm task force, whenever we have to deviate from the US core, we are in communication and collaboration with them, whether it's extending the US core profile and adding additional data elements, or if it is a matter of creating our own FHIR profile when the US core profile wasn't available. And a good example is the FHIR coverage resource. We created a profile so that we can consistently share the subscriber ID or member ID between a provider EHR system or their systems back to the payer, because that's an important identifier for the payer in knowing who that member or that patient is. We use QI core with our data exchange for quality measure, because quality measure work is really grounded in those QI core profiles, of course, many of which are also children of or derived from the US core profiles, but they add a number of important extensions onto those profiles in order to support clinical decision support. We have these links here to kind of core FHIR technologies, the CDS hooks, Smart on FHIR, and bulk data, because we use them in our implementation guide. So we need you to be comfortable and familiar with that. We have presentations around how to read implementation guides. We still get this question, so why do we need implementation guides? Really, the reason is the same reason you need recipes. So I like the metaphor of the commercial kitchen, commercial test kitchen. You might have all these ingredients in the pantry and all these tools and processes in your kitchen, but that doesn't make you a meal. And it certainly doesn't make you a consistent meal if you were to try to develop recipes for a national chain of restaurants. And so think of these implementation guides as a recipe, a standard operating procedure, whatever you want to call it, that we can then give to the implementers to help them standardize the use of FHIR within a given workflow. And so this presentation is by Linda Michelson of Optum, who's a Da Vinci member and very active, and she gave this presentation to help understand how to use an implementation guide to read the IG, so that as you're reading them, you know what to look for. We have some additional things around the IG update. And then from there, we call out our implementation guides and group them, much like we do on that web page for the implementation guide dashboard. We try to group them together to help implementers understand the context for these guides, whether they are CMS, ONC rules, or other trends that we're trying to address in the community. So this is a great page, and of course on each of these pages you can get to these links as a community member, and you can also comment if you want as well. And so there are additional tools here around our test scripts that I'll come back to in just a minute. So I want to encourage you to go to the this implementers website to kind of help you find resources. So next up is the DaVinci GitHub. So as I mentioned, we have these sample applications, and we have a DaVinci project organization that is underneath HL7's GitHub site. And on this site, you can, as many of you are probably already familiar with GitHub, you can access the code that we use for our applications and run them locally. The caveat really is, again, these applications are meant to exemplify the use cases. Can you confirm, Andrea, that you can still see my screen?
Yes, I can.
Okay, just making sure, because I thought I saw a Zoom note on that you couldn't. Okay, so you have all these resources as developers where you can download the code, you can look at the code, you can implement and run the code locally, and see how the sample application exemplifies the resources and operations that are in the guides. And you can certainly, based on GitHub, you can fork these, and a number of organizations have taken these as kind of the starter code for them as they're building out their own application. So each of the implementation guides has the sample application. Often we have two applications. We have a client-side application, and then we also have a server-side application that represents in a kind of black box what a payer server would do in terms of receiving a FHIR query and then providing a FHIR response. So lots of great content here for you, and we use this content as I'll describe in a minute in our Connectathons. So moving on. So we have now a number of implementations of our guides, and what we do is we use the Logica sandbox, which is a really great resource, and hopefully you have become familiar with it. You can sign up for an account. You can spin up a cloud-based FHIR server that is a 4.0.1 server. It also has features to do Smart on FHIR as well as CDS hooks, and we use that, and our contractors that support DaVinci also create applications and load them up, and we have them hosted. So if you're not familiar with the sandbox, the quick tour is that you can have your own local apps or cloud hosted apps. It links to the CDS hooks, so you can create a CDS hooks app and use their launch parameters. You can create specific launch scenarios with a particular patient in mind and a particular provider. There is sample data in here. Here there's just one because we kind of constrained it down, but you can create personas and practitioners, and it allows you to upload your own profiles and upload your own patients as well, and create sample data, which if you're going to do testing, that's really important, and having data that's that exemplifies the use case is really important, and something that we're working on in DaVinci to try to create an environment where we have patients that have data across payers and providers, which if you've done this before is not an easy task, especially if you want to make it have a good clinical longitudinal history as well as additional claims data. So we've been working on that so that we can help support Connectathons. But so in this case, we have this demo app. We selected a persona. we have a specific patient, and we create these patients and these scenarios based on the needs that we have identified, not only for the use case, but also what can we accomplish in terms of testing at Connectathons. Because as you all know, Connectathon testing is an important aspect of not only maturing FHIR, maturing and testing these implementation guides, but also supporting the implementer community and having a forum for them to ask questions when things are not necessarily clear enough in the guides. So this was a scenario we created for this particular patient. So we write up a particular scenario. And the key here is, an important thing to bring up, is that this isn't a UI you would expect to see in the real world. This is something to help a user understand what's going on in the background, because as you know, we're trying to describe FHIR, and FHIR is really like good plumbing, and without a faucet or a shower head, it's really hard to show good plumbing. And so we use these use cases to exemplify it. And so some of the things we do is make the ability for you to configure your own endpoint. So you can, we've set it up for the Connectathon that we have a CQF ruler endpoint where Alforo, our contractor supporting this, has implemented a CQF ruler implementation. So we have this endpoint, then we can set up the patient, and okay, so we ran a care gap report. You can see here the request that was sent and then the response, because the care gaps isn't something you would necessarily have a user, it would be part of maybe a pop health application, but as an implementer, you could see what's in the care gaps report. And if you turned on the developer tools in your browser, you could see the actual exchange that's happening with this particular server endpoint. So with each of these reference implementations, you can use them here during the Connectathon. These are the same applications that are in that GitHub site that I showed you. So you'll be able to pull these up as well and implement them locally and use the sandbox and create an app that you would run locally, which is really great as you're trying to test out the sample applications, or as you're developing your own applications. So, we, as I mentioned here, we have a number of these sandboxes that we've created that support not only IGs, but we've also created some here that we use for Connectathons. In this particular sandbox, we tried to have both the clinical data that we use to support the payer patient access API from the payer, as well as claims data, so that you could use and test out the care and blue button endpoints as well. So I think that's a cool aspect of what we're doing to try to help show, if you had a single app and you wanted to hit multiple endpoints or a database that had multiple kinds of data, you could, using these sandboxes. Next up are our testing tools. So we work with Aegis and the Touchstone platform, and we have a number of test scripts that they have developed for us. And I didn't set this up quite right. And you can find these test scripts, and they're readily available because they're public test scripts. And my login cut off. And so you can download these test scripts and run them in your own tests during the Connectathon. For those organizations that are Da Vinci members, these test scripts and the testing can be run all the time. If you're a community member and you don't have a Touchstone license, you can create an org or create one on behalf of your org and run them on a limited basis outside of Connectathons. But then, if that works well for you, you can also, get an enterprise license. So I would direct you to the Aegis folks for more information around that. But let me pull up again, actually, our test scripts that we have. And again, this is part of the implementer support page. So hopefully this will work pretty easily for you. So down here on the right-hand side, we have a number of presentations around using Touchstone for validation. And so it's the steps you need to go. Step one, set up your organization, how to set up testing. So we have a bunch of videos, And then we should have a link here for test scripts. So for example, here are our test scripts. So you can see what test scripts are available. So we have this DaVinci organization here. So you can look and run these test scripts on your own. And so next up, we have a few more, and I want to try to finish in enough time. So we've covered kind of general education things. We've covered now some of these tools. And so the next part of the conversation is how do you engage with the DaVinci community as an implementer? So we have, as part of our weekly calls, a set of use case calls. And these use case calls are occurring almost every day. I think Monday may be the only day that we don't have a use case call. And again, you can find the use case call documentation on the left-hand side navigation. So here they are. And so you can see all the different use cases have their own part of the tree. And when you go to select one to participate in, say you wanted to join one that's going to start a little later around data exchange for quality measure, you can find information about the call itself and whether or not, we also include other information around if you're interested in working in the project calls. So you can get the call, the meeting notes of each of the meetings that we have. So if you want to go back and find out what we talked about, that information is there. But let's say you want to actually participate in the call. We work with HL7 and use the HL7 calling calendar. So this is the call calendar, and you can reach this call calendar by going to events on the HL7 homepage, and you can find the conference calls. I'm not going to click on this because sometimes it runs a little slow, but if you can find out the calls for any given day of the week specifically, or you can look at calls by the group or project that's running the call. So in particular, we have a list of DaVinci calls during the week. So you can spend your entire week, much like I do, on these DaVinci implementer calls. And for some of the calls, like this burden reduction call that is on Tuesday, we have specific implementer support calls. So if you have particular information, questions, you can join that call. We open it up at the beginning of the call for any questions that have come up from the community. And if we don't have specific questions, we jump into our agenda as we try to do things like create examples or address things that have come up in implementation that are important for us to use to update our guides. One of the current conversations in this particular call is if we're going to use FHIR questionnaire and CQL to gather information from the EHR, how do you share the value sets that the CQL needs? So that's one that we're trying to tackle, because we need to be able to define that so that the Smart on FHIR apps, which may be generic apps, can access that information. So this is a great place to know what activities we're doing. You can, of course, sign up for the listserv for each of these so that you can find out if they get rescheduled or canceled, like during a Connectathon or during a work group meeting. So you can, if you clicked on any of these, you'll have the call details. We still keep our call details here. They're not, it's not clickable, but you can copy and paste it. I know with other HL7 calls, you have to get that information by logging into Confluence, and we just haven't quite done that yet. We haven't had too many problems, hopefully, with Zoom bombers. So this is how you reach our, find out about our calls, and we invite you to come participate in the calls. Initially, you might just want to listen and see what's happening in the calls. But as you come up with questions, this is another avenue to ask questions to the use case leads and the reference implementation developers about our implementation guides. Next up are Connectathons. Connectathons are such a great way to engage with the implementer community. I put up this web page for the CMS Connectathon, which is one that's coming up next month. And so often the Connectathons will have a kind of registration page to give you an overview of what's going to be talked about. And not surprisingly, at the CMS Connectathon, we're going to be talking about a number of FHIR implementation guides and FHIR topics that are important around the regulatory landscape with FHIR, which is really important. But with each of these Connectathons, we also have a Connectathon page in Confluence, not surprisingly. So setting up an account in Confluence would be a really worthwhile task. And just so I make sure I cover it, if you go to confluence.hl7.com, at the homepage is a form you can fill out to request an account so that you can access Confluence and be able to contribute to the content that's in Confluence. And you may actually need it to get some of the call-in information. But back to this page, which is the FHIR page in Confluence. So this is the home page. And within this FHIR part of the Confluence website are all the Connectathons. So we recently had the May Connectathon. And so they're reprising a number of the tracks from that May Connectathon in the CMS Connectathon. So if you were to click on one of these pages, you would see more details about what's going to happen on during the track at the Connectathon. So we have a description of the Connectathon. We have links to the Zulip stream, the IGs, who's leading it, and then for you all as participants, what roles are we looking to test out at the Connectathon? Payer, provider, patient. We often have a scenario that we've created and clinical data that underlies that. We look at the various steps that we want to be testing, whether we're testing it for improving the IG or testing it for you all in the implementer community. So you know the steps that are available to you. So a number of steps. We also have links to test scripts. This is for CMS, and that's not for another month. So these pages are still being built out and updated. But the key here is if you're going to participate in Connectathon, and I certainly want to encourage you all to participate in Connectathon, you want to look at these pages. You want to engage with the track leads for these Connectathons. You want to find out where they're having the conversations in anticipation of the Connectathon. So typically for Da Vinci, those will be done during those use case calls. But if it's not clear, please reach out to the track leads and find out where, because the mantra I like to say is the more you can prepare in anticipation of a Connectathon, the more you will get out of the Connectathon. So if it's your first Connectathon, often you get just kind of figuring out what's happening. It's a little overwhelming, but as you are engaging in future Connectathons, working with your organizations around things like are you going to be using a test sandbox? Do you want to have a sandbox that's the organization is setting up for other testers? So to address issues around security and how you're going to deal with security, because it always comes up. And you don't want to be dealing with it on the day of a Connectathon because that's just going to delay your progress. So addressing those kind of things in advance and testing as much as you can in advance with other participants so that we start with getting into the cultural habit of doing testing and Connectathon-like activities all the time, not just when it leads up to the Connectathons, so that we can all advance and really start proving out the capabilities that we can do with FHIR and really showing how you don't have to wait to Connectathon. We got to connect in between and go from pilots to production as quickly as possible. So encourage you again to look at the Connectathon page, sign up for Connectathons. The last one, we also did some education. So that's the kind of the next topic I want to mention. Educate yourself. You're here at DevDays, which is awesome because it's a great way to get a lot of FHIR knowledge all at once, and it may be a little overwhelming, but that's okay. We have a ton of resources for you to educate yourself. We have live events. Da Vinci in particular has done now 2 or 3, I forget, I think 3 education events where we do a number of things where we go from a landscape view of what we're doing in Da Vinci, like have CMS folks come or FAST and ONC folks come and talk about where the regulators are looking to take FHIR. then we do, like we did for this event on a Monday afternoon, and it was open to the Connectathon registrants where we gave education. So we did basic FHIR 101, how to read an IG, how to understand the importance of US core profiles, as well as how to do testing. So I split that work, that presentation, that section up with Linda Michelson, who did the IG overview, Brett Marquardt, who did the US core, and myself, Richard Edema from Aegis, who talked about testing. So all these presentations are also available on demand. So we posted all of those recordings, and they're available through the education portal at through HL7. So you can click on Education on Demand and find the recordings. So you don't have to wait for the next event. This is a great way to educate yourself around FHIR. You can not only do this on demand, but we have FHIR training throughout the year that's both synchronous and asynchronous that you can sign up for, and you can find that on the education portal. So this is my second to last slide. We want to encourage you to join the HL7 and the FHIR and the DaVinci communities, and you can do that and join the DaVinci listserv and find out about events that are happening, updates on calls. We do fairly regular blogs, and if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me both in Whova or via email. We're happy to point you in the right direction, and we look forward to having you join us on our use case calls, picking up our IGs, joining us in Connectathons, and helping us to make our implementation guides better. So if you find things that are not clear in our IGs, use the link at the bottom of every IG and give us feedback so that we can improve the IGs. We recognize that those of us who participate in that IG development are only a small percentage of the people who actually have to read the IGs. So with that, I will end here my presentations and find my Whova app and see if there are any questions. Oh, here they are. So can you give us some context as to how patient access API offered by various cloud providers related to DaVinci projects? So terminology. Patient Access API is a CMS term, and that's what they noted in their regulations. They also note, though, specific technical components or guidance for complying with that notion of a Patient Access API. So they point to 3 of our implementation guides. Those implementation guides are the Payer Data Exchange, the Formulary Guide, and the Provider Directory, and the 4th one, which isn't a DaVinci guide, is the Karen guide. And so when you talk to the cloud vendors, you would expect that if they say they have a Patient Access API compliant API or endpoint, that it should be testable using our test scripts, that they use the same profiles and they have the same operations as defined by our implementation guides. So you can certainly check the capability statement to define that. Question number 2, what is the exact requirement of the Cures Act? Who is supposed to do what? What data is made available for app developers? What is the best channel for developers to access this data? Wow, that is a much more complicated question. So the Cures Act, I would point you to the ONC website, healthit.gov, where they have a number of resources for developers to understand the details of the Cures Act. Specifically for FHIR, I'll highlight 4 requirements. One is the implementation of FHIR version 4.0.1 by Health IT certified applications. Details the compliance date is the end of next year. Number 2 is the Smart on FHIR app launch and the OpenID authorization framework, and the use of the US CDI, the US core data for interoperability, as the defining the terminology necessary to comply. And the US core overlaps US CDI, but is not wholly inclusive of, covers everything in US CDI, and US CDI doesn't address everything that's in US core. And then data available for app developers. That is your opportunity is to develop your tests against our implementation guide. Go to Connectathons, and if you work with you can learn more from the payers at least, and work with, say, through Karen, if you want to look at how to do the patient access API data. So I would encourage that conversation depending on what kind of app you're developing. Are you developing a B2B app or a patient to business app? Lastly, if I have enough time, 1 minute, can any developer build patient access API applications? Yes, you can. If you have a cool app, you could develop it, and you would have to do some app registration with a vendor or say a payer or provider, and then be able to access, use the Smart on FHIR and the OAuth to allow your users to use those applications. Wow, that was a lightning fast 45 minutes. So of course, I'd be happy to answer additional questions through Whova, and invite you all to join the community and participate in the FHIR Da Vinci work. And the fact that you're here is just a great start. And thank you for all your contribution to the FHIR community. Back to you, Andrea.
Thank you, Viet. Wow, that was really impressive. You handled those really well. And thank you to everybody for joining us today. Like Viet said, if you do have additional questions, you're free to post them in the Q&A box on Whova. And we'd also appreciate it if you could rate the session by clicking on the link in Whova in the session information. And thank you again. That concludes today's session, and everybody take care.
Thanks, folks. Have a great day.